Welcome back, everyone. This is Surf, and today we are looking at the Kingdom of England, a British puppet, and one with a really extensive focus tree and decisions thing. Like, you physically have to campaign and make sure your party wins, and at this point, you can only do the as far as the Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance is concerned, you can only do the democratic path. I've lost an election in one playthrough and gone communist, and there's no focus tree. That's something you should know. But let's get right on in. Now for the brief history. Although American aid came to the English in the World War, it was too late, and for the first time, England was invaded by a foreign power. Her empire stripped away, and with an occupation force ensuring good order and civility of the English people, England now faces its darkest hour, with no Arthur to save it. If anything can be said of the British, however, it is that they are hard-headed, and even now, 20 years later, whispers of rebellion spread. The nation now sits on a tipping point. Collaborate with the wicked Hun, or risk everything trying to stop them. The Kingdom of England has three national decisions: keeping ahead, the King's Speech, and writing on the walls, starting with keeping ahead. Batten down the hatches, for the London police force are ready for any and all interventions. Crowds will be carefully monitored and methods of evacuation and detention planned out beforehand. Any suspicious individuals will be kept well away from main viewing sections, and there will be exceptionally thorough checks for stashed weapons in the days before the speech commences. His Majesty will enjoy a nice speech, a polite lunch afterwards, and will then go home. End of story. Without interference from any rebel scum. Those HMMLR buggers think they can get the best of the London police? Well, they have another thing coming. Secondly, the King's Speech. The day has come. King Edward VIII of the House Windsor may not be a well-liked man, but he is nonetheless the King of England. The speech, it would appear, will start at midday and go for an hour or so before the Majesty attends a late lunch with some notable public figures. Of course, that assumes everything goes to plan. Both HMMLR and the government knew something will occur, but what exactly happens is up to the will of God at this point. The coin of history tosses and turns in the air, the face upon it which will land unknown by those who threw it. Perhaps HMMLR will be correct in their assumption that all the dry tinder needs is a spark, or perhaps the government prepared well. Who can say? Only one way to find out. Lastly, writing on the walls. One need only look at the streets of London to see how ripe the city is for revolution. It's like a bale of hay, only in need of a spark to set the entire house afire. The police are no problem. Those who aren't on our side will be dealt with by the ones who are, and if they can't be bribed, into staying back, of course. The crowds, that was something Bill's lads solved. Turns out, when you know half the unions in the country, you can get a few of them to turn out and act as a disruptive influence for a public event like this speech. With Sterling's lot acting as civvies to lead them, we ought to give the king a right surprise when he turns up for tea and biscuits, something this entire country will remember forever. The Kingdom of England also has three national spirits: Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance, Our Own People's Hate, and Across the Channel. Beginning with Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance. Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance has been a persistent annoyance for a decade, absorbing the communist and rogue military units which formed the majority of the resistance to government authority pre-London Uprising. Evidence suggests, however, that the government formed mere moments after our surrender to Germany, and their worrisome ability to stay largely undetected in their machinations limits our own capability to respond. In addition, HMMLR is believed to have a significant number of former military personnel in its ranks in addition to regular terrorists, which raises the question of whether they intend more direct action against us someday. Secondly, Our Own People's Hate. The Douglas Home government has the distinction of being the only government to last more than 4 years since the end of the war with Germany. Unfortunately, it is not popular with a good many people it rules despite this. The exact reasons vary, from perceived illegitimacy to discontent with the state of England, and even the simple desire to avenge those killed by the Germans or the collaborationist government. This lack of public support limits the government's ability to meaningfully pass legislation, as the royal party and its factions rest upon the knife's edge of becoming outright despised by the otherwise apathetic population. Fixing this will be a challenge to say the least. Thirdly, across the Channel. England is less than 40 kilometers from the German Reich across the English Channel, and despite our best efforts they have maintained the continued necessity of their garrison in Cornwall, keeping a hand ever ready to strike. The treaty, signed at the end of the war, mandates that we limit not only the size of our military, but its composition too, with strictly limited numbers of tanks and aircraft, and a similarly restricted navy, in a grotesque parody of the Treaty of Versailles. But whilst the Germans have insisted upon keeping the treaty strictly enforced, those remain the possibility that if the situation in Germania or England were to change, that this could be superseded. Alright, with the start screen information out of the way, now we can get into clicking on the nation and loading it up and the text that comes in through that, starting with the country information. Of Englishmen and the rest of the world, what is there to say but that they invaded most of it at one point or another? Perhaps then it is inevitable that they would be subject to the same deprivations they inflicted 1,000 nations at the hands of Germany. England in this new and untested era is not the same place as it once was, for instead of the traditional power structures it is led by a loose alliance of all those who want no more with the Reich. With the royal party under Alec Douglas Home, the party recovered greatly from the miserable days of the war and the chaos following the great 1953 London uprising by communist revolutionaries. Home leads the moderate faction of the RP, the largest portion of the coalition dedicated more to stability than the true ideals beyond that. At his side is Harold Macmillan and the Reformist, who nominally adhere to democratic principles but are willing to compromise with Home for the good of England. Also present are the hardliners, dedicated fascists led by Arthur Kenneth Chesterton, who advocate for a state closer to the German model. Despite their differences, all three of these groups have been willing to work together for the sake of England's recovery. But recovery doesn't mean stability, for another faction exists within England, the HMMLR. Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance is a network of several different rebel groups all answering to one unknown man, allegedly called the Boss. The organization itself can be traced back to the aftermath of the Second World War, but it wasn't until the defeat and nigh annihilation of the Communist Party of Great Britain that the Third Battle of Cable Street that HMMLR rose to the forefront of the English rebel organizations. HMMLR proper are dedicated to the return of the person they believe is the rightful monarch of England, Queen Elizabeth II. A somewhat conservative organization, it is surprising that they are allied with the second largest faction, the Left Resistance, led by Bill Alexander, a veteran of the West Russian War, Spanish Civil War, and a dozen wars in between, along with being one of the few notable survivors of Third Cable Street. The Left Resistance are an eclectic mix of communist socialists and even most of the old Labour Party united under a common banner and cause. The third piece of the puzzle can be found in David Stirling and his Commandos, the only rebel group to be in active rebellion from the end of the Second World War when he deserted. Stirling's Commandos are the smallest of the three major parts of the HMMLR, but also the best trained and equipped. What sets them apart from their brethren, however, is their fierce republicanism and an unquenched desire for vengeance upon the traitors to England. These two factors will eventually have to face off, though in what circumstances or when remains to be seen. But the victor will have an opportunity to decide not just the fate of England, but potentially the fate of Britain as well. So that is the state of the Kingdom of England right now, but I also, again, included the region information to allow us to zoom out on the entire British Isles to see what is going on with the neighbors of the Kingdom of England. An empire long united must divide, and an empire long divided must unite. The Kingdom of England, Great Britain, Northern Ireland, is no more. The horrors of World War II and the German invasion sundering the nation apart. The chief of the nations in former Great Britain still is England, though once at the head of an empire which spanned the globe. In the modern era, England has fallen on hard times. The collaborationist government of the royal party, a loose alliance of those unwilling to risk the ire of Germania, governs the country in a decidedly undemocratic manner. Nonetheless, under the leadership of Alec Douglas Home, the collaborationists have managed to piece together a functional administration for the first time in years. Not all the men of England submit to the German yoke. Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance, the HMMLR, are the foremost group in the struggle against fascism. A mix of communists, monarchists, and everything in between, HMMLR is united most solely by their mutual antipathy for the collaborationists and all who serve them. But the balance between those two groups is precarious, and who knows what could happen should the international stage move erratically. In the north, the Republic of Scotland holds out as the last truly democratic nation on the Isles, formed not by treaty but by rogue Field Marshal Wimberley and John McCormack's Scottish National Party as a last bid to ward off advancing German forces. Scotland is an eclectic mix of exiles, natives, and soldiers that share only their hatred for the Reich and all those who serve her in common. Yet despite existing for nigh on 2 decades, the Republic is fundamentally unstable, riven by divides between nationalists, unionists, and other parties still. The future of Scotland is dependent on that of England, and whether an independent Scotland is the future or a blip on the historical radar is yet to be seen. To the west of England lies the nation of Wales, forcibly separated from the England over the course of the Treaty of Surrender. The Welsh have attempted to rebuild their nation, which hasn't existed in over 7 centuries, to varying results. Internally, the Welsh are even more split by the matter of unionism than their Scottish brethren, with parties all across the political spectrum holding a variety of opinions on the matter, the only consistent agreement being that a union at present would be disastrous. A potential issue in the future of Wales might be their primary export. The coal mines of the Welsh primarily export to Germany after all, and were something to interrupt this might prove disastrous for the fledgling Celtic nation. Across the Irish Sea, the Republic of Ireland ekes out a meager existence as the second of the Unity Pact's allies on the British Isles. Aiding the Germans in their conquest of Northern Ireland, and during the course of the Second World War, the Irish have few friends to be found outside the Pact's influence. With the situation growing more and more unstable in Europe, however, the future of the Emerald Isle is an uncertain one, and is likely to be impacted heavily by whomever emerges victorious in Britain. But the Irish people are not known for giving in to inevitable results. One way or another, the English will find that out firsthand when the time comes. Britain is a land of chaos, a land of unrest, a land of opportunity. Whom shall rise and whom shall fall is left up to those who take power for themselves. Let the winner take all. In terms of important people, Alec Douglas Home, head of state and government, is the only one with an in-game character description. The other members of government have wikis, but not any descriptions in-game or in those wikis. Alexander Douglas Home was not a man born into any true power. He served in the Territorial Army to no great success, married his wife Elizabeth in a ceremony of little note, and served as a member of Parliament with little influence before leaving in 1937 to be aide of Neville Chamberlain. Though initially serving as Chamberlain's eye in the House, after he left the government, Home was caught up in bigger problems. He spent most of 1940 to 1943 in a full cast from the spinal tuberculosis he had removed. Thus, Home missed much of the bungling of the Unity government in the war effort, along with much of the blame, something which proved useful when the Germans invaded. Home was present at the signing of the peace treaty that dissolved the United Kingdom by virtue of inheriting his father's lordship in 1942, but held little influence in English affairs for the remainder of the decade. In the 1950s, however, proved more favorable, with Home emerging as perhaps the archetypal representative of the Loyalist establishment, desiring above all else to prevent a second invasion. The royal party is de facto an alliance of several groups, such as 1 p.m. after another fell into infighting, riots, and German disagreements. Home simply kept rising, first to the leader of the House of Lords, then to foreign minister under Mountbatten. Finally, following the brief leaderless year of 1958, Home was convinced to take the post of Prime Minister. Home's government has been a relatively stable one compared to his predecessors. He has managed to solidify the royal party, and is tolerated if not exactly liked by the garrison in Cornwall. Now, however, with the rising influence of the HMMLR, Home faces more perilous straits, and whether he shall lead his nation into survival or damnation remains to be seen. Alright, and that's currently all that we have on the Kingdom of England at the start date of January 1st, 1962. Next episode, we will be looking at the Republic of Ireland and everything that goes along with them. So subscribe to the video, do it, and like it, and do everything. And I'll see you next time.